Yeah! All right, well, you know, it's really funny. If we look back the past 20, 30, even 40 years of application development, just to see how far we've come. You know, from the time that we shipped the entire DOS operating system with every app we wrote, to the time when the GUI became mainstream and totally revamped the way that we presented our apps to customers, and then when our good friend Al Gore invented the internet and changed the way that we thought about distributed applications. And now, where we are today, how many of you guys are excited about the potential that the Slate and mobile devices and touch technology are bringing us? Yeah, it's great, great, great. So with each of these paradigm shifts, we as developers often have to reset and kind of think about what we have to learn to update our skills. And I saw this awesome tweet the other day after Steven Sinofsky's keynote that said, "Hooray, finally, with Windows 8, I don't have to re-image my job skills." And you know, joking aside, that's actually a pretty cool claim to make. So what we're going to do today is take you through how you can use your previous investments in learning about the .NET data stack and apply that knowledge to building new applications on the Windows 8 platform. My name is David DeWinter. I'm joined here by Jeff Durstadt, and we're going to take you through creating immersive data experiences with the Entity Framework. So we have a few objectives that we'd like to get through today. The first, we want to make sure that everybody here has the foundations of what the Entity Framework and Code First can do for you. Next, we'll take that knowledge and apply it to the Windows 8 platform to show you how you can build data-enabled applications using the Metro style. And finally, we will show you a little bit about what's coming in the next version of the Entity Framework.
All right, so for those of you who've been following the Entity Framework, since we shipped the first version with .NET 3.5 SP1, you'll know that that first release contained very basic object relational mapping capabilities. You'll also know that while that release worked well for some of you, it really didn't meet everyone's expectations. So following that, we did a lot of listening. We listened to the way that you wanted to build your applications. And this led us to introduce some new features like POCO support, lazy loading, customized code gen with T4, and foreign keys. Now, these weren't particularly fancy features, but they allowed you to get a lot of your work done. So we call this release the Working Horse Edition. Now, earlier this year, we released Entity Framework 4.1. And this was a standalone release on top of .NET 4. And it introduced two key new features. The first was a code-centric style of doing your data modeling called Code First. And the second was a simplified API we call the DB Context API. Now, one of the other really important parts of the EF 4.1 release was it was the first time we introduced a convention over configuration-based approach for developing data access code. Now, these conventions give developers a lot of productivity. So some members of the community independently decided to name the EF 4.1 release the Magic Unicorn Edition. So today, we're going to be talking about the next version of the Entity Framework. And we don't have a cute little animal for it, but maybe some of you out in the community can help us with that. So some ideas, you know, like the Magic Platypus Edition, or the Angry Dragon Edition, or my favorite, the Metro-style Narwhal Dolphin Edition.
And just in case you were wondering, we like to call that first one the Dejected Donkey Edition.
That's right. So the Entity Framework offers several different ways of doing your development. Now, when you're building an application, some things you don't have a choice over. So for example, will your application be targeting an existing database your company already has? Or will you be required to provision a new database as part of that application development? Now, some other things you do have a choice over, and the Entity Framework helps give you that choice. So in that case, do you like to build your data model using a visual designer where you can drag and drop entities on the screen and connect them with lines? Or do you prefer a code-centric way of doing your data modeling? Now, the key point is no matter what your situation, the entity framework has something that can help you build your data access stack. So for example, if you like that visual experience, but you need help building that new database, you can drag and drop entities, and we have tooling within Visual Studio that will help create that initial SQL script that you can deploy and get your application up and running against a new database. Likewise, if you still like the visual experience, but you want to target an existing database, we have tooling and wizards inside our Entity Designer to go look at that existing database and reverse engineer a data model, a default data model, that you can display and edit. Now, on the other side, if you really prefer a code-centric way of doing your data modeling, you can use code first. And you can do that regardless of whether you're targeting a new database, in which case code first and conventions and configuration can help get you that database up at runtime, or you can use code first with an existing database. And we've got some new tools we're going to show you on how to get started with that. So today, primarily we're going to be focusing on code first in our demos.
So that's enough for the slides for now. Let's go ahead and look at our first demo. So with this demo, we're going to build an application called Social Me. And the point of this app is to connect people with events going on in their community. Now, we're going to do this as a simple console application so we can take away all the complexities of other parts of the .NET stack so we can focus on the entity framework. So the first thing we need to do when building an entity framework application is to build a data model. This data model, because we're using code first, is represented in terms of .NET classes and .NET properties. So here we'll build a simple two-class model with event and person. On the event class, we have a couple of properties already, like an ID, a name, a description, and when the event actually occurs. Next, we also have a person class, which also has a few properties, like ID and name. Now, the other interesting point about this model is that we'll relate these two entities together and say that this event has a particular person who organizes it. So we'll add two properties, one on the event class to represent this relationship, and the other on the person class.
Got to give me a second to catch up here.
Oh, wow. Got to learn how to spell, Jeff.
So we'll add a collection property over here. And it's going to be an I collection of our events. Organizing.
OK, great. So now we're ready to start using the EF.
All right, so the first thing we would normally do is we need a reference to our entity framework project, or reference to our entity framework DLL. Now, to do that, we're going to use the package manager technology called NuGet. And you all saw Scott Guthrie do this in yesterday's keynote. So we'll right-click on References, and we'll manage NuGet packages. And you can see here's the online feed of everything that's available in NuGet. How many of you have used NuGet yourselves? All right, awesome. So what I've got here is I also have a local NuGet feed, because as I mentioned, we're going to be showing you the next version of the entity framework. So I'm going to click on that version, hit Install, accept the licensing agreement, and hit Close. And you can see we have our reference here to the new entity framework DLL.
So at this point, we've got our reference to the entity framework, and we're ready to start using it. So the entity framework DLL exposes a single class that is very important to you, and that's the DB context class. This acts as a facade that your application can use to connect to the database in question. So to start using this, what we'll do is to create a class which subclasses DB context and exposes a couple of properties of type DB set. Now, these DB set properties look like any other .NET collection, but really they offer a powerful way of executing CRUD operations against your database, which represent queries against the entities in question. So, for example, here we've got two properties, one for events and one for people. So now at this point, we've got our context, we've got our model. Let's start using them to build a data application. So we'll hop over to main, and then we'll break this down into two parts. The first part is to populate some data in our database. So to do this, we'll start by creating a new instance of the social context that we just created. we'll check and make sure that there's no events that already exist in the database, because we might run this multiple times. And then finally, we'll insert some seed data that we have in a snippet. Now, even though this is a snippet, it looks pretty similar to how you would add any other object to any other .NET collection. So we're adding a person and a couple of events that he organizes. And then you'll notice at the bottom that we're calling this method called save changes. And that's flushing all of the adds that we just did into the database. So next, for the second part of this workflow, we'll go ahead and create a new instance of the context yet again, but this time we'll query for the events that we just saved. So to do this, we'll simply iterate over the events DB set that we created earlier and write out all of the names of those events. So at this point, let's run it. So you can see these are the events that we saved to the database. But you may be wondering something. We didn't provide a connection string, and we didn't actually create a database either. So what's going on here? Well, Jeff talked about earlier that the Code First release was one of the first ones where we focused on convention over configuration. Now, one of the first conventions that we run here is that Code First looks to see if we have a connection string provided. And if there's none, then it will go out to the local SQL Express instance on the machine and automatically try to create a database which maps to the data model that we have in code. So we can hop over to the Enhanced Server Explorer inside of Visual Studio 11 and take a look at what's happened. As you can see, we have a database created called socialme.socialContext. This is the same name as the DB context that we just created. If we drill into the tables that we have in this database, and as well into those columns, we can start to see some other conventions that were applied. For example, the names of these tables were derived directly from the names of the properties that we specified on the DB context class. You can also see that the .NET data types we use were translated directly to SQL Server data types, like string to nvarchar max. You can also see that properties named ID were automatically marked as primary keys, even though we didn't specify that to Code First. And finally, you can see that the association property that we had between event and person has been translated into a foreign key.
Well, that's pretty cool, David, but sometimes conventions aren't really appropriate in every case. So what would we do here if, say, name, we don't really need a max length here. What if we want to limit that?
So that's a good point. Obviously, we realize that not all the conventions are going to work for everybody. So we've given you two ways to override them. The first way is by using data annotations, and the second way is by using something called the Fluent API. Now, data annotations are they're very specific attributes inside of the system component model data annotations namespace. And what we can do here is we can apply some of those attributes to various properties on our class. So for example, name, we can apply the max length attribute and specify something different than nvarchar max. And similarly, we can apply another attribute, like the required attribute, to say that this is a non-nullable column. Now, let's go ahead and look at some of the other data annotations that we have available. So we'll pull up System Component Model Data Annotations Assembly inside of the Object Browser, and you can see there are quite a few other attributes for you to choose from. For example, the column attribute allows you to specify different column names from what you have in your .NET classes. The foreign key attribute allows you to specify how foreign keys are mapped. And also the table attribute allows you to change how the names of the tables appear in the database. But as you can see, there are many others available for you to choose from. Now, data annotations are great because they're a succinct way of decorating your classes to make small changes. But there are some cases where their expressiveness is not enough to map exactly what you want to your database. And in those cases, we have to use something called the Fluent API. Now, let's go ahead and see an example of why we would need to use this. So first, let's add another association between event and person. And this represents, for an event, who's attending that event, and for a person, what are all the events that I'm attending. So we'll go ahead and create two properties again, one on each type. And you'll notice that it's now a little ambiguous to a program like CodeFirst to figure out which property on the person class maps to which property on the event class. So what we'll do at this point is to drop down to the Fluent API and tell it how this mapping works. So to use this, we'll override a method called onModelCreating inside of our DBContext class. This method exposes a single parameter of type DBModelBuilder. Now, the DBModelBuilder is the root from which you use the Fluent API. Now, if you're not familiar with what that term means, I've been saying it a lot, Fluent API. Think of it as a strongly typed API where IntelliSense is your guide as to what options and configuration you have available to you. As an example, we can start by configuring the event entity, and we can say that each event has many attendees, each with many events that they're attending. Now, because this is a many-to-many relationship, it maps to a join table in the database. We could stop the configuration here, but let's go ahead and make one other change and change the name of the join table as it appears in SQL Server. So we'll make this a little more intelligible to our developers and call the table attendance. So now we've done quite a few things. So let's go back and recap for a second. We created a data model and let CodeFirst provision a database based on a couple of conventions. And now we've taken those conventions and overridden them using data annotations and the Fluent API. But there is a problem here. And that is, we now have a code model which is out of sync with the database that we just created earlier.
That's right. And as you saw, it's pretty easy to get into this situation where you're evolving your data model and you want your database to stay in sync with those changes. Now, for anybody who's used Entity Framework 4.1, we included a piece of technology called database initializers. And what that was the first time when your app domain was running, the first time you instantiated one of your context instances, we would run some code for you to help deal with that change. But we didn't have a lot of options available for you. We could either create an initial database if it didn't exist. We could throw an exception saying that the model was out of sync with the database. Or you could drop your database, which in the case of a production database isn't very good, and recreate it. So through the CTP process of CodeFirst, and following our RTM release earlier this year, we heard a lot of feedback about, hey, could you guys give us something that would help with this? Help us keep our CodeFirst model in sync with the database and preserve all of our data that we might have in production. So what we're going to show you now is something we call Entity Framework migrations. And to show you kind of an overview of what we're going to do, let's switch back to slides for a second here. So this is where we started. We had an event class. It had an ID, a name, a description, when the event was. And name had this max length, and it was based on a convention. So the first thing we did was we made a code change. We added that data annotation attribute to limit the length of the name to 128 characters. So this is where we can use the first of our Entity Framework migrations commands, and it's add migration. Now, add migration does two very important things. The first thing is it does a diff, or a schema compare, between your current model and the model you had before. And it builds a sort of diffgram. And in this case, that diffgram contains the information that the name column's length changed from max to 128. Now, the second thing add migration does is it then scaffolds out C# or VB code for you to represent that database change. So as you can see here, that's represented by this call to change column. We're changing the name column on the events table, and we're now saying that it should be a string with a max length of 128. Now, with Entity Framework migrations, you can then apply these steps up to your database by using the update database command. Now, what this does is it translates that C# or VB script into backing SQL needed to make that change on your database. And then update database also can go ahead and apply that change on your test or production database. So now let's see a demo of that in action. So we'll switch back to our project. And the way you get started with Entity Framework migrations is you install a NuGet package. So we'll go down here, and instead of using the UI, I'm going to use the Package Manager console. And we can install the package. Install package, except for I want my local feed. Entity Framework migrations. And what it did was it added a new assembly in my references, entity framework.migrations. And it also scaffolded out this class for us called settings. And what settings is asking us to do first is saying, tell me about the context you're going to be evolving. So I'll fill that in here. Put your code first context type name here, and that's our social context. And the rest of our settings file just has options that we can tell Entity Framework migrations about. So for example, should we generate the code using C# or VB? And what kind of database are we going to? In our case, we're still going against SQL Server, so we can close our settings file. Now we've made our code change, so let's run our first Entity Framework migrations command. So we'll run add migration, and we'll give it a name called first updates. We'll hit enter. It's going out and doing a diff between our new model and our previous model, and you can see that it scaffolded out some code for us. So let's take a look at that. So you can see here's the code that we need to get our database back in sync. And it's kind of like a Fluent API in C# here. So we're creating a table called attendance. And we've defined the properties here, event ID and person ID. And you can see it defines the data types and primary keys and foreign keys. And it also picked up that we're changing a column. We're changing that name column on the events table. And we're redefining it as a non-nullable string with a max length 128. And those changes really came from those data annotations that we put there. Now, the other thing I want to point out about migrations is kind of where Entity Framework migrations decided to store the file. So they're stored here in a little folder called migrations. And you can see the file name has this really hot name with a giant timestamp on it. And what that does is it just helps Entity Framework migrations know which migration steps have been applied to different databases and what order to apply them in. So you get a lot of control over what's happening to your database with this solution. So once you have this script the way that you want it, you can type in update database, hit enter. It saw that we hadn't yet applied this particular migration step, and so it applied it for us. We can go over to our Server Explorer again. We'll pin that. And if we refresh our tables, we can see that we now have the attendance table, which is our join table that it created. And if you look down here, you can see that the name column has been updated to an nvarchar 128, and it's no longer nullable. So just to make sure we didn't cheat or anything like that, let's take a look at our data. We can unpin that. And you can see that our instance data was maintained. So this is exactly what you want inside of your developer experience. We made some changes to our code, and we used Entity Framework migrations to migrate our database incrementally while still preserving our instance data here.
OK, so before we wrap up this first demo, let's have just a little bit more fun with this model. So Jeff, can you add a category property to the event class?
Sure.
So if this were the Entity Framework from last year, we might have to add this property as a string, or maybe even an int if we really liked having magic numbers in our code, which I'm sure all of you do. But what we can do instead is take advantage of something that you've been asking for a very long time now. So I got a question for you guys. Who can tell me the #1 top most requested feature of the Entity Framework today? Enums. I heard it somewhere. Unfortunately, I don't have another slate to give you guys or something. So actually, we've heard your feedback. And I'm very excited to announce that in the next version of the Entity Framework, we will have full support for the enum data type. About time, right? So Jeff, let's go ahead and make category an enum.
All right, so the first thing we have to do here is we can just add an enum type. So we have an enum for category. It's got a couple members on it: conference category, sports, the arts, and just because. And then all we need to do is change the type of our category property to be a category. Now again, we're in this situation where our data model is no longer in sync with our database. So because we have full support for enums and we're working with migrations, we can use migrations to help add that column to our database. So we'll add a migration. We'll call it add category. We'll hit enter. And you can see that what it did was it scaffolded out this C# code to say, hey, add a column on the events table called category, and make that category an integer. So here you can see some of the object relational mapping. And what we've done is we mapped that enum type in .NET to an integer column in your database. Now there's one other kind of key thing about these scripts that we're seeing here, this add category script. And that's that once it's scaffolded, it's your script. And you can edit it or add things to it or remove things from it as you see fit. And in this case, I know that my database already has some instance data in it. I know it's got those 2 rows that we put in earlier. So when I add this category column, is it possible for me to populate those existing rows with some data? And the answer is absolutely yes. So we can go in here and we can say, hey, the default value for this particular column should have a value of 1, which corresponds to one of our enum values. So there you go. You can make a change, any change you want, to your code first migration script before you run it.
So one of the other changes that we can actually make here is another thing that you guys have been asking for in migrations as well as code first. And that's a way to specify some things that are in your database that may not have a similar representation in your data model. And a prime example of this are database indexes. So what we can do is we can create an index on the column that we've just created here, this category column, simply by calling the createIndex method inside of this migration script.
So once we've done that, and as I was saying, we made a bunch of changes to our script. We changed the default value. We've added a line to create an index. We can run this script. So I'll run update database here, hit enter. Entity Framework Migrations found that there was only one pending script. We'd already run that other script on our database, so it just ran this one. If we pin over Server Explorer again, and we refresh the events table, we can see that, yep, we got our category column right there, and it's an integer, and it's non-nullable. And we also have our index property. And let's check out the data here. And we can see that our category column was populated with our default value that we had. Now, just to add some diversity to this data, I'm going to change one of these values to 2, so we can do some interesting queries with this.
OK. So now we've seen how you can represent enums inside of your data model. Let's actually take this full circle and show how you can use enums directly within the link pipeline. So we'll head back up to our main method, where originally we queried for all of the events. But this time, let's query for just the events which are of the category conference. So we'll make a few modifications here simply by making a link query that does a filter on the category property. Now notice there's no int casting or anything. This is just the enum data type right here. So once we iterate over this again, let's rerun the app. And you can see there's just one event that's returned. So there you have it. You have the enum data type in your data model, using migrations to scaffold that to the database, creating an index on that column, and then having that come full circle through the link query pipeline. So we've done a lot of stuff so far. We've talked about how you can create a data model and how you can use code first to provision a database based on that data model, and use a bunch of conventions to help you get started very quickly. We talked about how you can configure stuff using the data annotations and the Fluent API. We talked about how you can incrementally evolve your model using entity framework migrations. And we also showed you a sneak peek at some of the new features like enums. But now, let's take all that knowledge and take it to the Windows 8 platform. So we started off with our data model, and then we connected that data model with a database. Here, we used SQL Express. But of course, this can be any database, including something off-premise like SQL Azure. Now, in order to connect this to Windows 8, we need to build something called a WCF data service. Now, you can think of WCF data services as the Microsoft implementation of handling the OData protocol. So OData is, simply put, a simple way of sharing data and its associated metadata across a variety of different platforms. Now, the business advantage of using OData is that there's already an extremely rich ecosystem of producers and consumers of this OData. For example, not only do we have clients that can consume this on the .NET stack, but you can also see this in Java and PHP, on mobile devices like the Windows Phone, iPhone, and Android. And of course, we have a preview on Windows 8 today with the Metro-style applications. Now, because OData is platform agnostic, we could use this in both the HTML5 version of these Metro-style apps or the .NET and XAML version of these apps. Now, for the sake of time, we're going to focus on building an application just with the .NET version today. So to do this, what we'll demonstrate is rebuilding the Social Me application on Windows 8.
All right, so what we've got here is just an empty web project, and I've called it, if you look right here, Social Me Service. So as David mentioned, the first thing we need to do here is build our data model and connect it up to a database. Now, we could do the same thing we did before, where I wrote some C# classes, have code first, use convention and configuration to provision that for me. But what we'd like to do instead is target an existing database up on SQL Azure. And to help us do that, we're going to show you something we call the Entity Framework Code First Power Tools. And you can get these off the Visual Studio Extension Gallery today. And what you can do is you can right-click on your project, and it gives you this Entity Framework menu. And you can reverse engineer code first from an existing database. So if you paste in your SQL Azure server name and then type in your credentials, and it will let you select the database that's up there. I'm going to pick the database called Social and click OK. What the Power Tools are now doing are they're going out to SQL Azure, they're looking at that database schema, and they're scaffolding out C# classes and code first style mappings to add to my project so that I can start doing my data access with code first right away. So you can see what we've got here. What it gave us first was a social context, just like we had before. And we can see that it has a bunch of DB sets, things like event categories, events, and people. Now, for this particular example, we decided to make the categories a little bit bigger than just an enum property. So they've got things in them like a description and a photo URI, in addition to just the name. And we also have event and person. And so let's take a look at what it did for those particular types. If we look at person, it looks pretty similar. It's got an ID, a name, and a link to a photo. But here you can see it just named the navigation properties, events and events1. And that's because the Power Tools, while they're pretty cool, they can't read your mind. It doesn't know what these two navigations mean. But I've done this enough times to know that this first one are actually the organizing property, and the second one are all the people attending. Now, likewise, if we hop over to event, we can see that it has a bunch of properties, and it needs the same sort of correction. So it's got this person navigation property, and that's the organizer. And people are the attendees. Now, before we move on, I want to draw your attention to one other thing, and that's this location property right here. Now, location could be like a complex type, like an address, but we decided to take advantage of something else that's new with the Entity Framework. And if you look at the type, you can see it's DB geography. Now, what this is its actual latitude and longitude information stored up on SQL Azure as part of a geography type that will now be able to bring down into the Entity Framework and expose over the OData protocol. So this is all coming in the next version of the Entity Framework. So once we have our data model, we need to create a WCF data service around it. And to do that, I'm going to show you another really cool thing you can do with the new Code First Power Tools. So I've got my data model. It took about 1 or 2 clicks to get that going. I'm going to right-click on my context, go to my Entity Framework menu, and select Create WCF Data Service right there. except it went away. So we'll create that data service, and this adds all the needed project references, and it also scaffolded out this code for us for our data service. And it called it social service, and it derives from data service. And we've linked that to our DB context class, social context. Now, the Power Tools also knew which sets were interesting to us, so it added a bunch of access rules to give us read capabilities to our sets, like event categories, events, and people. So we'll make our service the start page, and we'll run this so we can view our data in the browser. So there you can see our 3 different sets we can access: event categories, events, and people. And we can do a couple things like, well, let's look at the events. And so what you've got here with WCF Data Services is you've got a REST-based way of accessing your data now through the URIs. So here are all the events, and you can go down and see here that, here's an event, it's got a name, and here's that location data we talked about. How's that for a circle? But you can do other cool things in here, like let's select the first event and look at the organizer. And so you've got an entire interesting way of doing REST queries against your data model just by creating that WCF data service around it. So now at this point, we've created our model, and we use the Power Tools to help us do that. And we created a WCF data service around it, and now our data is exposed as OData.
OK. So actually, there's one more thing that we should show before we move on, and that's the metadata that's exposed as part of this service.
All right. So we can do that by doing a $metadata on our service. And here you can see that the types are all exposed there. So event category, and you can see in here all the properties, like there's the ID is the key, and you can see the types and all that kind of stuff.
So the reason I showed you that will become clear in just a second. So we've got our WCF data service up and running, and now we need to connect that with a Windows 8 Metro-style application. Now, normally what we do in this situation is to just go to File, New Project, and look at some of the new Windows Metro-style project templates that have been provided. The one that we're going to use is based off the grid application, which is really nice because it uses a new control in the Windows XAML exposure for these applications called a grid view. Now, the grid view is nice because it exposes a way to visualize collections of collections. And we have a set of event categories, and then for each of those event categories, we have a set of events that we'd like to display. Now, because we want to focus on the data side of the application instead of the UI, we've gone ahead and pre-built the UI for this, but we'll show how we actually connect the Windows 8 Metro-style app with the WCF data service. So now we've hopped over to our Metro application. And the first thing that we need to do, or that we should be able to do, is right-click on something, the service reference folder, and say Add Service Reference. Now, this tooling doesn't yet exist in the preview edition. So what we'll do instead is use something called Data SVC Util. Now, this tool is really helpful because it's going to look at that metadata that we just showed you and create some client code that makes it easy for any .NET client to consume that data service. So we've got this client code. Let's go ahead and add it to our application and see what happens. So once that's inside our app, we can see that it got a couple of files generated for us. The first, and perhaps most important, is this thing called the social context. Yes, it's back. So the social context here is not the DB context that we saw before. The DB context connects directly to SQL Azure, and it resides on the server. The social context here is what's called a data service context, and that helps us abstract away all of the complexities of HTTP requests and XML parsing to the OData feed itself. So the advantage of using this client code is that we can now use this context and query for objects instead of going down to the lower level of XML parsing and HTTP requests. So as you can see, there are a couple of different properties in this context. For example, events, event categories, and people. Each of these are exposed as a data service query. And we'll show you how those are used in just a second. The rest of this file just contains the other classes like event category, event, and person. And we'll show you how we can use those right now. So let's hop over to the app.xaml.cs. For this application, we have such a small data set that we're going to grab everything when the application starts up and display it in the user interface. So we'll look at this onLaunch method. And as you can probably guess, this is called when we start up the application for the first time. So what this will do is we'll call into a series of methods called showGroupCollection. It creates a new instance of the starting page and binds some data to that groups property. Now, we have this populateCollection method stubbed out. So here we can start to select all of the data that we need. So first, let's create an instance of that context that we had before, the social context. All we need to do here is specify the URI that we can find the data service at, which is easy. It's just at the localhost port 50,000. Afterwards, we can start to use some of the many properties on that social context to query for information. Here, we're interested in event categories. So we'll select the event categories property, and we're also interested in each of those event categories associated events and attending people. So we'll use an expand operator to say, once we get the event categories, give me all that other stuff as well. So at this point, we're using a query that's doing something like an HTTP request, which could block the UI. And I'm sure you guys know, if you've seen the keynote and big picture sessions, that Windows 8 Metro-style applications are all asynchronous. So what we can do instead is use an extension method we've got called execute async. What this will do is it returns a task that takes care of all of the, the begin execute, end execute complexities of this API. So once we've got that task, we can use the new C# 5.0 features for async to await on that result. And it's just like calling it synchronously. Now, the last thing that we need to do is bind the result of this to the to the UI. Now, instead of using the model classes, we have a method called bindResult, which is just going to translate these model classes to appropriate view models for the UI to use. So at this point, let's go ahead and start the app and see what happens. So as you can see, when we start up, the event categories and all the events were brought down from the server. The grid view control exposes all of the event categories in this Metro-style view, so we can swipe left and right to see all of the different event categories and their associated events. Now we can click on any particular event, and you can see that the application is asking us if we want to use our geolocation information. The reason we did this is because we want to highlight one way that you can take advantage of spatial data in the entity framework in OData. So each of these events has a particular location associated with them. And we also know where we are today. And because these devices are no longer your desktops sitting at home, I mean, they're these slate devices you take around, we want to show off the fact that you can actually use geolocation information. So if we click on this first direction, you can see that it's correctly pinpointed us inside of the Anaheim Convention Center. And we're getting directions directly to this event. So at this point, you've seen a lot of stuff. You've seen how we can create this WCF data service to expose your data models to the outside world. And definitely from there, how you can use Windows 8 Metro-style applications and show this data in a rich and immersive way. So at this point, what we're going to do is change gears a little bit and show you what's coming up in the next version of the Entity Framework.
All right, so we've already talked about a couple things and shown you a couple things that will be in the next version of the Entity Framework. So you saw us use enums both in our data model, as well as doing that within a link query. You saw a little bit of us using spatial data. And one of the things you didn't see with spatial data is it's often necessary to do some computation around that spatial data. So for example, can I take 2 points and actually compute how far away those 2 points are from each other? Or can I see if one polygon is inside of another polygon? Well, that's not always the kind of computation you want to do on your client. So with spatial data and the entity framework, you'll be able to use those spatial functions like distance, and they will get translated into SQL so that they can be executed on SQL Server. Now, you also saw a little preview of our experience around entity framework migrations. As I said before, this is available as a CTP right now. You can go out and look at it on NuGet. We'd actually really love your feedback on that because we're still tweaking the experience quite a bit. So some of the other features that we have with the next version of the entity framework are table-valued functions. Now, table-valued functions are like stored procedures. They're functions in the database. But what you can do with this is you can compose over the result. And one example of that is, let's say you wrote a table-valued function that used something like SQL full text search. Well, that would return you some results, but then in your client, you could actually write a link query around those results and have everything computed on the server so you could just filter or order that full text search result. We've also done a number of performance improvements to the next version of the entity framework. One of them is called automatic compiled link queries. So how many people have used compiled query in the past to optimize their entity framework? Yeah, well, you don't have to do that anymore because link queries are automatically compiled, those expressions, and they're cached. And we've seen on our internal testing upwards of 25% or more performance gain just by using the new version of entity framework and this feature. Now, the other nice thing about this feature is if you're using WCF data services on top of an entity framework model, like we showed in our last demo, you're going to get this feature for free. So all your WCF data services queries, they're going to be automatically compiled in that service, and you're going to get a nice performance gain there. We've also done a bunch of work around optimizing the SQL we generate. Now, I think this is a perennial feature we're going to be working on for a long time. But in this release, we focused on improving the SQL we generate, particularly around inheritance hierarchies. Now, another thing we've done with stored procedures is we now support stored procedures with multiple result sets. So you can use those as part of your model. Now, another area that we didn't get to show, but we've done a really significant investment in, is around our entity designer and our tooling. Now, one of the things that a lot of you have been asking about is there a way for me to do multiple diagrams inside the designer, particularly if you have a large model? Well, in the next version, you'll be able to do that so you can partition that large model into multiple views. Another really significant, all right. So another really significant thing we've done is we've taken the entity designer and we've been able to tightly couple it with a new database project that's available in the latest CTP of the new version of SQL Server and the tools around SQL Server. Now, what this integration allows you to do is create a new database project that's been completely redesigned to manage your database and at the same time have an entity data model that maps to that particular database and database project. Now, if you make changes in the database project, you can flow those changes all the way down to your entity model and have them reflected automatically for you. And you can also do the reverse. If you make a change to your entity model, it will tell you what changes are needed and make those changes for you in your database project and push those up to the database. It's a really cool piece of technology.
So let's have a look at some of the other things that are going on this week here at Build. So tomorrow, we have a couple other OData sessions if you're interested in learning more about the OData protocol and how it actually works in applications. The first is focusing mainly on OData as it stands today, and it's in combination with Windows Azure. And the next one talks about the future of OData. We actually have both the presenters here in the room, Mike Flasco and Pablo Castro. So those will definitely be some great sessions to check out tomorrow afternoon. Next, if you're interested in learning more about the entity framework, definitely check out our resources slide on msdn.com. So our site is really simple to remember, msdn.com/ef. If you're a beginner looking for how to get started, or even if you're just looking for specific tutorials, you'll find a wealth of information there, like walkthroughs, how-to videos, white papers, and so on. You can also see that our ASP.NET our partners over in the ASP.NET team have built a series of tutorials using MVC and Code First. If you're interested in getting up-to-the-minute release information and walkthroughs as they come out live, definitely check out our ADO.NET team blog. And if you're interested in giving feedback on some of the new features coming in the next version of the entity framework, or looking at what the team is designing for the next versions, check out the EF Design blog as well. If you want to vote for features and see how other people in the community are prioritizing features, definitely check out our user voice site at ef.mswish.net. And finally, we've talked about a lot of different technologies today. One of the releases we've talked about was the power tools, which you can grab today from the Visual Studio Gallery. And the other one is the June 2011 CTP, which actually demonstrates a lot of the features like enums and spatial that we also talked about. Now, one of the other things we don't have on the slide, because there isn't a particular link for it, is migrations. Most of the migration stuff that we showed here today is actually available for you as a NuGet package, entityframework.migration. And as always, we are always looking for feedback on this stuff. So if you have any suggestions, concerns, complaints, etc., please come up to us here. Our emails are in the deck. We have lots of these other avenues that we're all listening to as well. So let's have a look at what we actually talked about today. We talked about how you can get the foundations of the entity framework and code first and use them to help you build quick data-enabled applications. We talked about how you can use that knowledge and apply it to building Windows 8 Metro-style applications. And finally, we talked about some of the new features in EFV Next. So on behalf of Jeff and myself, we'd like to thank you for coming. And we hope you've learned a lot about the entity framework in Windows 8. And we hope you have a great week here at Build.
Thank you.